issues keep interfering. So I'm unable to keep stick to it. So let me start with the presentation. So with ये एडवांस क्यों नहीं हो रहा? आगे क्यों नहीं जा रहा है?
You can, yeah, okay.
Okay. Yeah, okay, fine. Okay, great. Okay, first of all, not motivation, but the motivating factor, why I got into this at all. There's no mathematics, so not a problem for anyone. Now, essentially, the starting point for me was if you look at some of the technological developments in the USA in 1980s, you will see most of them were time saving. For example, kitchen appliances. Most 80s technological advances took place in the kitchen about how to save people's time, whether it is through refrigerators, we become intelligent or etc., etc. But they were mainly in the kitchen. Then they moved on to other places. Since 2000 in particular, it becomes very clear that all technological changes are really trying in electronics, for example, convergence. Idea is how many things can I do together at one time? Because time saving, time saving is what struck me whenever I thought of any of these inventions. They were not necessarily new things, but how can I save time on what I am doing? Now, if you move on, the next clue to me came in the 2008 crash, global crash. And I'm referring to a book here by Paul Zuckerman, Penguin, 2009. There was a guy called Paulson, and he bet against the Wall Street, and he made billions of dollars in 2-3 days. And let me tell you how. He sort of, he's one of his RAs working in his firm, just new kid from Stanford, was drawing a graph where he was plotting the real growth. He was plotting the growth of real estate transactions against the growth rate of population. And he found the growth rate of transactions much higher than the growth rate of population. And he speculated that this had to collapse like any speculative market for a simple reason. Ultimately, a person can stay in one house or two houses. He can't stay in 6. So there will come a time when he will want to get out. And, I won't explain the whole system in the USA, where you have this problem of, people buying houses on the basis of, they take hypothecate their houses, and then there are mortgages, and then people actually, because of derivatives and because of technology, are able to set up a market on mortgages. So you can sort of, you can bet on the mortgages. And he actually bought up a whole lot of mortgages, hoping that some point of time, everyone will try to get out at the same time. Insurance companies will be asked to finance it. And then if he had all the insurance bought up, he would be the holder. And that's actually what happened. Everyone came together, and suddenly you found everyone wanted to encash. Banks all wanted to encash what they call the subprime loans that they had, which are all built against houses, because in the US there's almost no margin. There wasn't enough. So they had to call in the mortgages from wherever, who was holding all the rights, the derivatives, they called it, and the market crashed. And he made the prices shot up, he made billions. And this is what this book is about. And all this based on the simple graph. And the graph was growth in population and growth in this thing. That's what first made me realize that, this is the problem. That the financial transactions, especially with technology coming on, I'll come to that, the financial transactions are growing faster than real transactions, and creating a divergence between the financial real economy. That's not new, but it matters over here, and I'll see why. So one evidence we looked at here, you can see the graph. We looked at compound average growth rate of payments, taking that as a proxy, not the best, but as a proxy for for the financial transactions, and compound average growth rates of world GDP as evidence of growth in real transactions. And you see a huge difference in these two. Things. Slowing down, is it? Why won't it move? Sumit, this seems to get stuck in between. अब आगे नहीं जा रहा है ये. नहीं, हार्ड डिस्क
डेस्कटॉप पे कॉपी है ना.
हाँ.
मैं से बंद करके दोबारा चलाएंगे.
क्यों? Hang on, he's suggesting that something is hanging, so I might have to stop, close this pen drive and stop share and start again.
So we just saw your slide move on.
Oh, you could see it, I couldn't see it. Okay, well, it doesn't matter, we do a quick share screen, doesn't take long. Share. Okay, so this is where we already been. So, yeah, okay. So if I just go back a bit, we took another evidence. We looked at the growth in services and financial services trade, and we also looked at growth in what are called the mode one of us working globally. And we found again the same trend which is there, that the financial transactions or service transactions, we want to call them, are growing much faster than real transactions. And I said, is this a new form of the classical dichotomy? I don't know. It just was something I thought about that time. Now, why such divergence? And this is a critical part. If you look at technology, it has a major part. In the 50s to 80s, most of the technology was taking place in terms of communication, in shipping, air costs and land transport costs, which means manufacturing could now move to the global market because the transportation costs was so dramatic. A combination of GATT, which meant dramatic reduction in tariffs, and decline in transport costs, that is shipping. These two combined led to a huge growth in rise of manufacturing. And of course, GATT, along with this technology of reducing transport costs, to a boom in world trade. I won't go into that now, but by between 1948, 50 and 1980, there was a massive increase in the amount of global trade, reached roughly about 60 or 65% around that time. Very rapid. Now, can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Is it moving?
No.
Yeah, that's wondering why mine is not. Sumit, okay, seems to work with a lag. Now, at the 2000s, the difference was the new technology, was the digital technology, and a tremendous decline in the cost of financial transactions. One is the cost of manufacturing transportation, the other was the cost of financial transactions globally, led to a huge growth in the rise of services. Now, what's the difference between the two? Digital technology enabling much cheaper and much larger set of financial transactions, and decline in shipping, air and land transport costs, leading to a decline in, if you want to call it, transactions in manufacturing products. And the difference is this: the digital technology can lead to an infinite subdivision of services. Unlike manufacturing, you can define any number of services. You can take any service and keep taking it down to the smallest possible multiple. But manufacturing, you can't do it, mainly because of the issue of fixed cost of any manufacturing. You can't make half a spark plug, right? You make a full spark plug. You can't make half a chassis. You have to make the full chassis. But in services, there's no. An example is of the 1980, 2008. You can take just the market for mortgages and define into many sub-markets, which we call derivative markets. There's no limit. And this, to me, was the important factor. There's a zero fixed cost of providing service, literally today. No limit on the number of services or products that you can offer. Now, I did write an article on this in November 1st in the Mint, where I in fact said that these so-called technical IPOs that are coming, of these we call, what you call unicorns. Now, each one is getting into a market for the same thing, but they are all expanding these services. But the consumer remains one. Let me give you an example. If the cost of digital transaction goes to close to zero, which is what it is today, then what happens? anyone can offer in the same transaction, but only one person can actually effect the transaction. Take the case of cars, the market for used cars. Everyone can bid because now everyone can go into a global market. I know what someone in Bangalore wants to buy, and I know what someone in Delhi wants to buy. I can remove all physical barriers to sales. I buy at the same time, I sell at the same time in Delhi, and I effect the transaction, I make the money. That's fair enough, because I just bridged the information gap. But what I haven't bridged is only one car that can be sold. So there's 50 guys trying to do the same thing, trying to sell the same car actually. There's only one who will sell, someone's going to be unsatisfied. And that's why I predicted that time. If you read the article, I did say that the stock market in these tech stocks is going to crash. In fact, I was looking today at an article which came out in the Mint. It came out on 20th. It came out 22nd February. There's a very good listing of is the new age tech bubble bursting. This to me is precisely related to the kind of issues I'm talking about. And here, what's the issue? This is what Paulson's trade, that famous book, The Greatest Trade Ever, which I mentioned. The growth of financial transactions is completely losing track with the growth of the real transaction. This could be affecting the stability of the global economy. By the way, I must mention here, for those who are more mathematically inclined, you might want to see the paper by Koopmans. I think it's a 1950s paper. Please write to me, I'll give you the reference, where they've in fact looked at very old transportation model. And what they find is that if you take manufacturers locating their plants in N places, and you find that there is no cost of moving from one to the other, no fixed cost, then this is an endless musical chairs. There's no limit. They couldn't solve it. They had to use a linear program problem to solve. They said there's no limit. That means when there is a question of delivery to an individual and there is no fixed cost of any transaction, there's no limit to how those transactions keep going round and round. Firms will keep going round and round, and the location of going round and round. Therefore, the fixed cost, which he called in terms of the transport costs or location costs, are what actually give fixity to the stability or equilibrium to the final solution. Anyway, that's just an aside. I just mentioned this. Now, here is what the issue comes to me, which I started thinking about. Now, Keynesian economics is limited, production is limited by income. Why? Because consumption is a function of income. However, now the things are different. Now, consumption in this kind of system, which I'm talking about, is a function not only of income and therefore how much income, but of time. And this is the critical part. Consumption requires physical time. Take simple introspection. Suppose you give yourselves ₹1 million, and you say you've got to spend it in a day. You won't be able to do it, not because you don't know what to buy, but because you're saying, if I buy all those things, how will I use these services? So use of services or use of any item requires time and is not only a function of income. And time is limited. Why? Well, everyone's day is 24 hours. Time is not going to go beyond 24 hours. So on the time as a variable has not been given the kind of emphasis in the past as things like income, productivity, etc. I will elaborate on this some more. But the physical aspect of consumption is what I'm trying to focus on here for individual. Now, here is the problem. Here, the clue to me came from a 1986 article by Marcuson. It's called The Eclectic Model of Trade. And question is, where is K in consumption? Income is there on consumption. Now, here is this critical line I'm mentioning. Capital substitutes labor in production, which we know from production function, but not in consumption, because there is no capital consumption. Logic being, if technology today is implying, let's say, creating these IoT or robots and all these things with the place held in production, and there's technically no limit on this production. But there's a limit on consumption because the robots don't consume, they only make. So you're adding on the production side, but you are reducing consumption because you don't have consumers, unless you also create consumers, which is not happening so far. And this is to me where I found why people are suddenly becoming so important in terms of this. So here I'm pointing out, this is to me the problem. Now here's the problem. This asymmetric treatment of K and L in a general model and a partial model is what is the problem. This asymmetry, I don't know any solution in theory. And for those interested in trade, I want to mention where this struck me. If you look at the famous model by Krugman on trade, and he talks about something at the end, he says, therefore, everything is a function of a parameter called theta, the trade people will know. And this is returns to scale. So when returns to scale become important, then this is important, otherwise it doesn't matter. But actually the theta also represents demand. It's also the index of diversity on the consumption side, but it doesn't suit him to talk about demand. It suits him at that point in time to call it returns to scale, because you're unable to separate the influences of these two. But I'm saying here is to me, the asymmetric problem. Or to take what Marcus himself mentions, we know in macroeconomics that we know that, for example, that trade this. If you look at the issue of elasticity of income elasticity, we know that there's an Engels law, right? And we know, and from there we then say in microeconomics, therefore, if a person's income increases, and income effects are important, cannot be ruled away, then the demand will increase more for the luxuries and less for the necessities, because the income elastic demand is higher for luxuries than for. But actually, you can't prove it. You have to assume it. You have to assume that luxuries are those which are more capital intensive, and therefore for which the demand is elastic. But you can't prove it, and that's why he calls it eclectic model, because that part he takes assumed it is true. High elastic demand implies capital intensity, but it's not really true. Now, what is the role of demographics? You can see how the individual is becoming so central, but not in the Marxist sense. I'm not talking about exploitation. I'm not saying you exploit people, no. Look at this growth rate of population. The only country where at least till 2020, at least till 2030, the population is going to be going up, at least in the relevant age group 15 to 49 is India. So if time, which is a function of population, consumption is a function of time, and time is a function of population. Individuals are the ones who have time. Capital doesn't require time. Then you not go, the only country where this demand is going to be forthcoming, if you look at time on the demand side and not on the production side, is India. At that moment, and in emerging countries, and I think that is what to me is the reason why people keep talking about why emerging countries matter. And they keep mentioning, and what was amazing to me is when you come back to India from anywhere, you say, but how can this be true? Because the average income, let's say in a big metro like Delhi, is about 10, 12,000 rupees. Where's the demand? And they are looking, unlike the old economics, they're looking at consumers as buyers of products, because consumption not only requires income, but requires physical time. There is no physical time in developed countries because the populations are declining. So there's only so much a person can consume because he has limited time. Now, demographic constraints are becoming depopulation. You can see Ruchir has made billions. Ruchir Sharma, I'm sure he has, talking about how no country in the last couple of decades, whatever, has grown beyond this natural growth of population. But at no point does he say, but why is this important from a theoretical point of view? And I believe it is because we have not looked at physical consumption as distinct from, if you want to call it, monetary consumption, because that's the way economics is. So is it a problem of overproduction? Yes, in developed countries. Why? Because technology, there's no limit to what you can do. But who's going to consume these products? There's a limit on that because your demographics are not favorable. So T has to be is there now. Tea on the production side is now well looked at. Time has been, Subhato is here. He and some guys have done this work where they looked at tea as outsourcing is the biggest example of tea on the production side. Then you have 24 hours a day in the US, you have 24 hours a day in India. But out of those 24 hours, some they've got to sleep. When they're asleep, we are awake. So you maximize productivity of time with the same productivity between, let's say, India and US. Total production in the world increases because when you are sleeping, we are awake. And when we are awake, you are sleeping. So that's what people have worked at on the production side. But on the demand side is what I have been at least trying to puzzle. So I am arguing here that purchasing cohorts are declining, and that is what seems to make people think that India matters in global affairs. But there are the problems which I will come to. Now, I also looked at that's not my area, but quick look at some of the growth models, where actually N figures, growth rate of population. Now, in Harold Domar model, most of you know, Domar is the official biographer, I think, of Keynes. He was trying to do a dynamic version of Keynes in his famous, the Harold Domar growth model. The knife edge problem, when he says growth is a function of savings and capital productivity. And he goes on to say the three concepts: voluntary rate of growth, natural rate of growth, and the actual rate of growth. And the whole debate in growth theory, but is again on the supply side, where voluntary growth and actual growth must be equal. Otherwise, there's going to be a problem of either convergence or divergence. And therefore, he says that since there's only one particular point where these two are equal, the voluntary rate of growth, actual growth, any change from that will lead to that's the Harold Domar model, will lead to a knife edge problem. You'll either expand or you'll contract enormously. And then came, of course, but you cannot ensure gross voluntary rate of growth equal to average the actual rate of growth. But still, it is a supply side which is being looked at, not the demand side. Now, key assumptions, of course, we know all this, that W and K upon L are fixed, no productivity. People argued, why should GW be fixed? Productivity can change. So why should the GW be fixed? You can raise the voluntary rate of growth and you can raise the actual rate of growth. So why should one be a constraint on the other, since productivity is not constrained, which is what was assumed by, of course, Keynes and Harold. Solo Swan, I looked at the Ramsey, Kasson and Koopman model. It is nothing new, actually. It's just a dynamic version of the Harold Domar model. And of course, he tries to work again about C and K, capital labor ratio and per capita consumption. What will be that little knife edge at which the two are equal? So we once again have a knife edge problem. It is not enough to say that we increase productivity, but you still have a knife edge problem, and there's only one point at which small k, that's capital labor ratio, and the per capita consumption will be equal. That's stability, but you still have a knife edge. Not a generalized knife edge, but a specialized depending on which region of the Solo Swan, graph model, the differential equation model, which graph, if you want to call it, where should you be? So focus again is what can reduce K and reduce G, and again on the supply side. But it is also argued that K could change, capital leverage change could make S upon K equal to N or less, but N remains the upper bound. But question is, N is always exogenous, and whatever is being discussed about time in terms of individuals, always on the supply side of the problem. So I didn't see anything new here either. Now come back to trade. The only place where role of demand, so I'm saying we are looking at the consumption side, we're looking at role of demand, only place where the role of demand comes, and therefore where T could be handled, was only in Krugman, the new trade theory, 1979 onwards. But again, he really is looking at the supply side. If you have fixed costs, then profits can exist. Imperfect competition reduce the profits to zero. So the number of firms will determine it. And therefore, there'll be more production. If there's more production, there'll be more consumption, because all consumers consume all products. is still a supply side model, but very intelligently, he has allowed the role of imperfect competition. That's all, but still a supply side model, but no demand model as such. Even the later developments by Millets, Antos and all, there they say, okay, there's Krugman has dropped homogeneity on the consumer side. Consumers could be heterogeneous, imperfect competition types. But Millet says, okay, forget consumers, firms can also be heterogeneous, and then he develops his own famous 2003 model. But again, role of time on the consumption side does not exist. I have not seen it. The way I am interpreting very intuitively is the time taken to consume any commodity, physical time. Now, margins and others have only looked at the increase of productivity of time again on the production side, but not on the demand side. I'm saying something different. I'm saying, and I'm going to, okay, let me just go back. In a paper that I wrote with Shugoto and Sugandha, we actually said, suppose you look at consumption function, and you say consumption function is a function not only of income, but of T. And the T is a disutility. So there are certain things you have to do, you don't want to do that. You have to cook, you have to eat, you have to do so many things that your 24 hours takes. And reason why you can't utilize the time in consumption is because you have to do those things. You can't say I'll avoid cooking for 2-3 days and I'll look at only television for 4 days. You'll be dead. You'll have to take time off for other things. What some people have done in outsourcing models, just like Shugoto and the other looked at time sourcing at the international level, domestically also, you could outsource the time in such a way that other people do the work for you. So I needed time to drive my car. I don't do that. I get someone else to drive the car, and then I sit at the back and do my work. And I can probably consume more because I can do something more in terms of physical consumption. But that presupposes the availability of the drivers. And this, to me, is the first problem in developed countries. They don't have any individual they can outsource their time to. They have outsourced as much time in these kind of activities that they could, and it's going to get worse over time because technology has no limit. But consumption is limited by number of individuals. And that's what is the kind of thing I'm really trying to say. But I'm saying something even more. I'm saying that what about you thinking of consumption or time as a disutility? So the more time you have to spend on certain things you don't want to do, the more disutility you have. We have done that in our paper in RIE, which I've mentioned here, 2020 paper, where we say that there are certain things which are irksome. So you have a consumption function defined over Y and T, and that T is time which is devoted to this, let's say, irksome work. And if I can reduce that time, my utility increases. And how can I do it? One way is by outsourcing it to someone else. Someone goes to the market and buys for you, or someone does something, which is what is available today in developing countries, because we can still outsource the time, but still requires some people to do it, but the people are there. So that's the first issue of consumption time. You cannot devote enough time to consumption, but this time is becoming a more limiting factor on consumption than even income is. Second problem for developed countries is that the production is increasing by leaps and bounds. But consumption is limited by time which is physical and which is not expanding because populations are declining. Now, here's the problem. We could match these two things if production and technology, which is there in the Western developed countries, could do the production and consumption would take place in the developing countries, then the problem is sorted out, at least to some extent. But here's the problem. Trade models don't allow that. Trade models say movement of commodities is a movement substitute of a factor of production, but it doesn't happen if the limiting factor is consumption. If the factor limiting consumption time, it doesn't work, because the whole models of trade are all again supply side models. Unless how can I transfer my demand is what is the difficulty. And that's why, as far as I'm aware, I don't see any trade model which look at this aspect. The limited Margins and Co. have done is about on the supply. So now, how do we incorporate this time? Sometimes the services that for which you need the time are those you can't outsource. For example, I could increase my productivity, I could increase my income, I could increase my consumption if I could outsource some of this tea. But there are certain things I need to do which don't allow outsourcing. For example, study. I need to study in order to be able to increase income and therefore allow for increased consumption. But I can't outsource my study to someone else. I have to do it myself. That solution I have not found yet. But at least the point I'm trying to make here again is this issue of I think two basic points after which I think I'd stop. The asymmetry between the treatment of capital and labor in microeconomics and general equilibrium is a big problem. In fact, even in general equilibrium models, I once did a Keogh paper, I think in 1985, where it said, suppose production also has income effects. That's a horrendous model to deal with in terms of the algebra involved. So, minute you allow income also to change in the general equilibrium model, when production changes, individual income changing, and you have imperfect competition, then you have all sorts of problems that I don't know how it works. So this is where I wanted to sort of say. So I said, I believe the reason why, despite all the pump priming in the developed countries after 2008, there was quite a lot. There's about 2 trillion something by the US, almost the equivalent amount by China. Yet, demand is static. Total trade as a ratio of GDP has remained around 60% between 2008 and 2019 before this COVID phenomena came. And it's not moving. And it's not moving not because of technology, which is what we all talk about, because technology is moving rapidly. I believe the problem is who will consume the products. We don't yet have trade model which say, how could consumption be transferred? Production transfer takes place. That's the actual model. That's okay. So your production can be transferred. You specialize one thing, you buy something you will be good at, you consume something, everyone consumes. But how does consumption get transferred? That part is something which I have not seen. We tried to do it in RIE paper. And we also get fairly interesting results with that one paper where we show that immigration may actually lead to increased production and reduced employment, unlike the usual fears. Because what it does is, it actually leads to a migration of this unutilized labor in the developing countries to developed countries, allows them to do the work that they don't want to do but have to do. Housework, cooking, etc., etc. That allows those people to use their income, their time to do production, raise their income. That also gives employment to the immigrants who are then able to also at least subsist on something where they were getting nothing, and therefore actually it's welfare increasing for everyone. That's itself was a reasonable thing we got from the immigration point of view. But analytically, I think the problem arises back in what I mentioned, that I believe that this current stagnation world demand from 2008 onwards, we don't know. And I think it could be because this mismatch between treatment of K and treatment of L in economics, moving from partial to general equilibrium, is something we don't know what the solution is. I don't know. I told you we tried to give a simple trade model, but I find even if I go to macro growth model, same problems. It's all supply side. But the role of time on the demand side is very, very under researched, as far as I can make out. Now, I think that's where I want to stop. So, need T on the demand side. I mentioned this Manoj Pant and Huria paper. So, we are back to GN, something that we never look at in growth models also. It's just a constraint. No one gets worried about it. Even if you look at the Ramsey-Koopman paper, there also you can see N is sort of doesn't matter. I can assume N to be anything. it makes no difference to the knife edge that Ramsey Coopman and all have tried to talk. What is the knife edge that is there in the choice between how there is only one K, that is small K capital labor ratio, and one per capita consumption, and which growth is stable. Otherwise, there is instability in regions. But the end sort of remains. You can see, you can work through the maths. I did that, and it doesn't matter. I can fix any growth rate in population. I'm saying, but that is not the issue. When N itself becomes the constraint, then what do we solve? How do we solve? Especially when N becomes the constraint, not on production as people have done, but on consumption. That is the question which I sort of leave open. I've got some mentions. There are some books: Churchill, War and Peace, Rise, Fall, Churchill, Nefedeva, etc. And this is the book I mentioned, Greatest Trade Ever by Gregory Zuckerman, who talks about this experience with this Paul, who just looked at how you could make millions by realizing that minute the real growth rate diverges too much from the financial growth rates, something's going to give. Now, in Keynesian model, it didn't need to give. That's why 30s, we could pump prime because of excess demand pump. But in today's model, that's not working. Okay, I think I'll stop here. Any questions, I'll be happy to take. So I know it's sort of not complete, but I'm just saying it's an aspect of economics which I couldn't figure out, because demand side models of trade have become so important, but the demand side is of model which Krugman talked, really not the demand side, still the supply side. It is not time determining consumption. It's time determining production, which of course others have also done. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, Manoj, I just had a, one kind of general point to make, which is that, so growth theory has always been, charged with this allegation that it ignores aggregate demand contributions to raising incomes, as you're pointing out. But aggregate demand does have a role in dual economies with a labor surplus sector that uses traditional modes of production, right? So there's this Lewisian aspect. So it enters there. And the second thing is, we know from Art Gray's JDE paper that subsistence consumption also causes multiple steady states in the neoclassical growth model. And worst of those steady states is actually a poverty trap. So it's not that. And then there's also recent work done by this guy in the University of New South Wales on integrating demand into these are Schumpeterian models, models of endogenous technological change. I can't remember the name, but he's a guy at the University of New South Wales. So I suspect if I understand what you're trying to say, is that what you need is a model like that where time is a constraint.
If you just to mention, I like your thought. I'll have to have a look at the other people. But Lewis, for example, Lewis still production side is release of labor force to produce more. I'm not worried about that. I'm saying, what about how do I change the fact that time is a physical aspect? I'm looking at in a sense, an overproduction crisis, not of the Marxian variety, but of the very fact that capital labor cannot be treated in the same way. The nature of the two is such that one consumes, one doesn't. And Jennicum solves the problem by saying every producer also consumer, every consumer is also producer. But in the real world, this is not true. If you increase K, you don't increase C unless you add time to it. That's, I think, where I started this whole conundrum in my mind, at least. That, so that's where the danger is. There's no, by the way, I was right. I actually made some good money out of it. I did buy shares in these tech firms and all, and I got out after about 1 week and made a lot of money. And if you look at the valuation of some of these firms like Zomato, etc., and this Broom, Shoe, all these pure ones which are working solely on the principle that I'm saying. Everyone attacking that 1%, but only 1% can actually buy a car. So the other millions, they are coming as close to perfect competition. The closest paper I've seen to trying to explain what I'm saying is the Koopman's paper, 50s paper, where he says that if you don't, then the limitation of perfect competition is that it is no equilibrium possible. And so if you have, as I said, I'll send you a reference on the paper. It's a 50s paper that if you have 10 sites and 10 factories have to locate, and each site has an equal demand profile. Unless you have a fixed cost of moving one side to the other, it's a constant merry-go-round. By the way, on an aside, I once wrote this in an old paper in Economic Times in my column. I said the same thing applies to marriages. So this is a jocular side, but makes sense. That the fixed cost of marriage in India is very high, right? It costs a lot of money. Two families get married. Who the hell, unless something really serious, would like to go through it again? And maybe that's causes stability. And my friend said, you're being illiberal. I said, no, I'm just using Koopman's paper. I'm not being illiberal. And that is why divorce is becoming common, because now there's no cost of a divorce. And the cost of divorce is probably something which prevents this merry-go-round. So here is what seems to be happening. Someone has got to get that merry-go-round working. I'm just giving an aside on something else I wrote. But this is what is struck me, that if you introspect, physical availability of time is a bigger limitation on consumption today, the way production is going, than actually income. And it's a production not on the constraint side, but on the demand side. I would be willing to buy 20 things if I had the money. And I give the example to you. You take $1 million, you got to spend by the end of the day. If I had people I could distribute everything to, maybe I could. But the developed countries don't have. And trade doesn't tell me how to translate, how to transform consumption across countries. Allows transformation, production, not consumption. So I told these are all thoughts, something which mostly is introspective, but I think the critical thing to me was this: you can never have symmetry of treatment of K&L in economics, because both are important in production, but only one matters in consumption. So unless you say any robot I produce will also say, look, I want my engine oil in the afternoon or whatever, you'll be stuck with this problem always. And that's why the declining growth of emerging economy, of global economy is such a serious issue. That the production is taking place in this country, but they have no consumption. We would like to have consumption, we don't have no production. How does one transfer technology across countries? Is far more important than how can one transfer capital across countries. That won't help. And that I don't know, because technology basically is if you're looking at technology transfer in a world of imperfect competition, right? In perfect competition, there cannot be any technology requirements. So how that will happen is something I don't know. It's just a conundrum. So maybe I should label this paper a conundrum. I have no solution, but we tried to answer that in the paper I wrote to Shubhato when I first broached it. We worked on a little thing where we add T as a disutility item. And, so you have C as a function of Y and T. And if T goes up, because you spend more time on doing these horrible things you don't want to do, you become disutility. Your utility goes down. So you have a trade-off to income and utility. But that trade-off could be solved if, for example, I could pass on someone else to do those dirty jobs for me. And then I therefore can be more. What about time where you can't help it? Like everyone says education is the way to go. I can't outsource my education, right? I can't tell someone, well, India, you can, I guess, go and get my degree for me. So I can't do that. Then you run into the problem. And this is the issue I think developed countries face today.
Maybe some other questions from people here? Ojasvita, Nikita?
So I think that in the developed countries, as you said, the time is a constraint. For example, development of self-driving cars. So technology is actually solving that problem, so as to speak. Because, for example, you said that you have to drive your car now with the development of the technology.
Yeah.
That frees up time.
Agreed.
So I think the production mix is the output mix is also changing over time.
No,
That's
you're
one
right.
observation.
You're right, Ojasvita. Let me answer the observation first. I thought of that.
Mhm.
But that only solves the problem of your spending time on driving. It doesn't solve the problem of buying the car. I won't buy a car just because someone else drives it, right? I have to be able to sit in it. And I need physical time to consume. You get my point? You need time to consume. Forget about time to produce. That only solves the other side. That you have autonomous cars, so you save the time on driving, you don't get drivers. But what about the fact that you have to buy a car and go somewhere on it? And car is not the only thing which is autonomous. Refrigerators are becoming autonomous. You come back home and it tells you, well, futuristic, that how much food there is, how much milk there is, how much what. But the question is, I still have to do those things. That's what's bothering me, not the production side. That's the problem of technology. They will create 1 million cars which drive themselves, but will they have 1 million people to buy those cars to sit in? That's the part which worries me.
Right. So basically, that the population growth rate is less than the replacement rate. So declining
Exactly.
population is a problem. So even in traditional models, so you are correctly, so you pointed out a lot of supply side models. But now, even in the general equilibrium setup, they've come up with heterogeneous agent models. So their argument is exactly what you're saying. So basically, people there are spender saver models, right? So spenders are the high MPC consumers, and
Mhm.
savers have low MPC. So it
Mhm.
calls for transfer, so the question is that how to actually transfer it in an international setup.
Yeah, it's the old Marxist question again, right? The
Yeah.
difference in MPCs,
Mhm.
the Karesky, etc. model. That I understand.
Mhm.
I said we don't have a mechanism. We don't want to use the Marxian mechanism, but we don't have a mechanism to do that. Trade can only transfer production. It
Right.
can't transfer consumption. That's what bothers me. Because the minute you're in the world of technology, you're in a good world, but you're also in a dangerous world. But the asymmetry between K and L becomes to me very stark. There is no limit, the famous, what is that called? Is it Moore's law? Which one? About technology multiplying itself every. That is always true, actually. In fact, if you look carefully, in retrospect, when you see a new product, everything tries to converge. So your telephone is also your phone. It is also your television. Maybe one day it will also become your car. So when you buy a consumption item, it is bundled. But if you unbundle it, people won't buy it. How will I get the time to do it? That's the kind of worry which bothers me. How you might be actually running into these problems of overproduction, not because of this, but people don't know, how do I transfer? Technology is the main factor, of course, but technology you can't transfer. There is the very existence of technology means perfect competition broken down, right? So there are no trade models which show you how to transfer technology, none. Only ones I have seen are FDI model, but they don't, are again very supply side. Yeah. I'm just saying this is a puzzle to me. And even handling it in general equilibrium, in the limited way we did in the RIE paper, is a big problem, analytically. And for those of you who are trade people, if you read the Marcuson article 86, he ran into the same problem. He needed elasticity of demand to be different. So income elasticity demand to be different. Distribution, if you want to look at, elastic demand have to be different, right? Or you can't have an issue of distribution. So, but his problem is he has to be also able to say in a external framework that commodities which are capital intensive, also those where elastic demand is higher. But in reality, how do you know? If you again look again the Krugman model, he says that for those who are familiar with the model, that coefficient theta is very critical to results. So returns to scale stronger is one thing, but the theta is also income index of diversity. He never talks about that. It could be the demand side which is driving the model, not the supply side. But it suited him intuitively to say returns to scale. So he said returns to scale. But how do you know? Anyway, just something to think about.
So, any further questions?
Okay, anyone, if you have any references you think you come across, be happy to, if you email it to me, and you can look at Google my name and you get my email address.
One person you may, I mean, this is more in the public choice, is someone called Craig Stubblebine.
Craig
Stubblebine. He was a public choice theorist. He worked with Jim Buchanan. He died about 15 years ago. He may have done something on this ages ago. He didn't publish that much, but
did something.
His name was Craig Stubblebine, Stubblebine.
Yeah, B-I-N-E. Okay. Let me search and see if there's anything which comes.
And where it's written up is in this textbook by a guy called John Steinspring, which is a basic micro with
John Steinspring.
Steinspring, Steinespring.
Yeah. It's a text on micro, is it?
Text on micro using one of these softwares. I think it's Maple or something, not MATLAB, Maple.
Okay.
He writes up this time use model, and there are all these time use surveys. By the way, the US has these time use surveys. You may want to motivate your model by looking at the time use survey data and the consumption data, and see whether there's something empirically there before you motivate the model. So you may be able to. You may be able to. There may be something.
Maybe let me have a look at this Steinspring. Well, this is the first time I've done this seminar on this, because this seems such a intuitive but not an economics thing. I didn't know how to put it. I actually went through macro and I found nothing there either. I thought maybe growth models, would have something. You could actually technically even generate cycles based on this problem. Something like the Samuelson accelerator multiplier tracks. But anyway, I'll have a look at this.
Yeah, I mean, that's the obvious question, is that if you don't, if the time is a constraint, then your consumption is not keeping up with production. Why will firms keep producing? They cut it back. I mean,
that's the fascinating thing they do. Because technology and life is own. See, they are producing. See, let me take this example which bothered me, which is why I didn't make a lot, but I made some pretty good money on quickly buying these stocks and then selling them out very quickly in a period of 5 days. They don't know. We are literally into a world of perfect competition today in delivery of services. Services is the culprit. There is no cost. Let me ask you the following question. Who can tell me the location of Byju's? Does anyone know where Byju's is? Byju's could be on the moon for all I'm concerned. All this required to start an education app, if you want to call it, is 1,200 rupees to start a web page and finished. That's it. And then you float it, and then the internet does the same thing after that. Internet will, and then there's nothing which says where you are. You need a bank account. but you don't need any physical. So the cost of setting up the sub-zero, that's typically what we have in perfect competition, right? There's no fixed cost. In which case there's infinite multiplication, but someone somewhere one day will say, hey, but there's only one Chetan, the idiot only wants one car, what to do? So the other 1,000 people who were banking on Chetan buying the car will have to do something about it. And so 99 people are going to destruct with the nature of this is such. And I told this guy was almost on the brink of bankruptcy, Paulson. He said that stupid market is not crashing. It's going on booming, booming, booming. And then one day the market crashed and everyone was trying to call in the mortgages and he had bought up all the futures and he made a killing. Just on this simple principle of divergence between growth rate in real products and manufacturers. In manufacturers can't happen because manufacturers by definition involve the fixed cost. And now with digital transactions, look what's happening in India. Digital transactions are free now, right? It pays me to make even a 30 rupee transaction by check, by currency. I have never used a checkbook, nor has anyone, I think, for the last how many years. And now this Paytm business means even the poorer income guy also doesn't use it. So there's no limit to how many of these guys can keep coming up. But ultimately, only one product can be sold, right? You can't sell more than one. One grape only one guy can consume, right? Then what happens to the other guys trying to sell the same grape? They'll go bust.
Manoj, I have to run, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I'll
Thank
have a
you
look
very
at
much. Thank you very much for your
think of
seminar.
anything, Chetan, you know my address, please send me a.
Yeah.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks. Wait, Kanishka, do you want to?
Yeah, we can close the seminar if there are no further questions.
Okay, any one of you have any questions, you feel free to write to me. My email address is mpant101@gmail.com, mpant10@gmail.com. And if you see something which looks like what I'm talking about, the role of time on the physical side of consumption, I'll be happy to have a look at it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks a lot.
How's,
Bye.
I- how's IG treating you? Or should be
Great
the
to
other
see
way
you.
around? How are you treating IG? Okay.
I'll
Okay,
talk to
bye.
you. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Any comments, please, happy to get them.
All right.
Bye. Bye.